Joining us for today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the rights of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman Smith, and I see Congresswoman Holland on this call as well. Thank you for your interest in this issue. I want to again, Rep. Holland is a Laguna Pueblo American and one of the first two Native American women elected to the House of Representatives. And it is especially fitting that she'll be co-chairing this hearing as well with us. And I want to say thank you. We have a large panel of excellent witnesses this morning, who I look forward to introducing shortly. So my remarks are going to be brief. It has been 10 years since this commission last examined the status of the human rights of Indigenous peoples in Latin America. At the same time, there was already an established international legal framework to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, specifically ILO Convention 169 and the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and important rulings had been issued by the Inter-American Human Rights System. The framework was strengthened in 2016 with the welcome adoption of the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the OAS General Assembly, the result of decades of advocacy by Indigenous communities and their allies all throughout the region, and formed by long histories of resistance to encroachment by governments and powerful economic actors. I have been privileged to meet with Indigenous leaders from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, Ecuador, and elsewhere many times over the years. I never fail to be inspired by their resilience. Yet, as we take stock today, it is hard to conclude that their situation has improved. The guarantees at the international level that are so often a point of reference for human rights advocates seem not to be translating quickly enough into the real gains that are needed on the ground. Indigenous peoples are still among this hemisphere's most vulnerable communities, still too often marginalized and discriminated. We see this reflected in high rates of poverty, poor health outcomes, including high mortality rates, vulnerability to disease and chronic conditions caused by pollution, lack of access to education and other public services, food insecurity. In Guatemala, up to 70% of Indigenous children are stunted due to malnutrition. Insecure land rights, including an inability to obtain land titles and a lack of control over the use or protection of natural resources located in their territories, something I've seen firsthand because I have been monitoring the COFAN struggle in Santa Rosa del Guamues in Colombia since 2008, and has shown no sign of abating. The killing of Indigenous social leaders, especially environmental activists. In Colombia, 242 Indigenous leaders have been assassinated since the signing of the peace accords in 2016. In Honduras, Honduras is one of the most dangerous places in the world for Indigenous defenders of land and the environment, as we saw in the tragic case of Berta Cáceres. Destruction of their territories due to illegal logging and mining, and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, which is advancing at a frightening pace. But this sobering list doesn't capture all that is at stake. The trampling and denial of the rights of Indigenous peoples can lead to their actual physical disappearance, or the extinguishing of their language, culture, family structures, and historic millennial ties to land and nature. In other words, their physical or de facto extinction. In Colombia alone, the UN has identified at least 32 Indigenous peoples at risk of imminent extinction. And that was before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, which, as we will hear today, has devastated many Indigenous communities throughout Latin America and placed some at even greater risk of extinction. In a few weeks, we will welcome a new administration under the leadership of President-elect Biden and a new Congress. I believe we can expect to see increased engagement with Latin America under Biden, and thus new opportunities to elevate the voices of Indigenous peoples. Our objective today is to take stock of some of the major challenges facing Indigenous communities in our hemisphere and begin to get some recommendations and proposals on the table. I believe we need to look both at our bilateral relationships, because the situations faced by Indigenous peoples vary by country, and at what more we should be doing in multilateral forums. We should be looking for opportunities to exercise diplomatic leadership, and we should be reviewing our use of foreign assistance. We should be examining the impacts of our trade agreements on Indigenous rights, and we should be asking if we are making sufficient use of our leverage in multilateral financial institutions. So some ideas may require legislation, others may simply depend on having an administration with the political will to move forward. So I'm eager to hear all of them. But before we hear from our witnesses today, I would like to yield to my co-chair, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, for convening to today's important hearing. I want to commend Congresswoman Deborah Haaland in particular for her commitment to the issue of Indigenous rights. It's, of course, my understanding that she helped put together this hearing, so thank you again, Deborah. It is, of course, fitting that we hold this hearing this month, as November is Native American Heritage Month. While there is much we could talk about with regards to the contributions of Native American citizens in our own country, today's hearings focus more broadly on the Americas, the countries of South and Central America in particular. Over the years, I have engaged in a number of issues adversely impacting the indigenous people of the Americas, the pattern of which bespeaks an historical indifference to their well-being and welfare. Peru is perhaps the country I've been most concretely engaged with, a country that I visited many times, most recently at the invitation of the Speaker of the Peru's Legislative Chamber, on the occasion of Peru's adoption of anti-human trafficking legislation modeled in part on my law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Trafficking is a crime that affects most directly indigenous women and girls, not only in Peru, but throughout the Americas. Trafficking in persons is often export-oriented, but it also occurs domestically, and both labor and sex trafficking are often associated with extractive industries, as men are often forced to work in conditions of servitude in a dangerous occupation, while women are coerced into sex slavery as well as working in those plants. All too often, it is the indigenous people who are exploited. Extractive industries are also impact indigenous communities in other ways, spoiling the environment and creating hazards which manifest themselves in high rates of diseases like cancer. I held a hearing, Mr. Chairman, in 2012 entitled Poison Harvest, Deadly U.S. Mine Pollution in Peru, which examined the impact which a smelter facility had on the Andean mining town of La Oroya, considered one of the most polluted places on Earth. Mr. Chairman, it is outrageous that far too often members of indigenous communities are considered secondary citizens, exploitable and ultimately expendable in pursuit of profits or utopian societal goals. The latter was revealed in another immensely impactful hearing that I chaired back in 1998 that concerned the forced abortion, sterilization, of indigenous women in Peru under the regime of Alberto Fujimori. They had health fairs where women were invited to come, and then against their will, they were forcibly sterilized. What is common in all these cases is a neglect of a fundamental principle of human rights discourse, that a person can never be used as a means to an end. Each rights-bearing individual is endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, in the words of our declaration, a document whose lofty aspirations are all too often we have fallen short in fulfilling. Which leads me to a note of caution, which bears relevance to today's hearing. It is individuals who are right bearers. While we can and must talk about rights and wrongs as they impact the community, we must nevertheless be cautious not to extinguish the individual in our discussion of the communal. In much of the Americas, in part to make up for past injustices done to indigenous communities, we see the elevation of communal laws and customs done at the expense of the individual in indigenous communities. For example, we see in certain Mexican communities and elsewhere in the Americas the denial of women's right to run for office in the community, or in some cases, even to vote. We see in Colombia and Mexico communities which mandate only one religion for the entirety of the community, with the expectation that its members all participate in public rituals. Those who do not conform because they, in good conscience, subscribe to other religious beliefs are often excluded from the community or at times jailed or even beaten for their nonconformity. And perhaps the most extreme case of denial of the most fundamental rights of the individuals we see in Brazil, where tribal jurisdictions children are often born with physical deformities or who later manifest mental deficiencies are deemed cursed and put to death in the most horrific way, burial alive. In such extreme cases, the rights of the community cannot supersede the rights of the individual. Therefore, we must be mindful, in the words of one commentator, of the right of women to vote in Native communities and the need to keep the I in Indigenous. And again, I thank you for convening this important hearing and yield back.
Thank you very much, and I would now like to yield to Representative Holland, who is responsible for us getting this hearing together today. So let me yield to her at this point.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Chairman Smith. I'm very appreciative of the work you have both led in this space. I'm not alone in saying that your tireless efforts to raise human rights issues has made a tremendous impact, and I'm happy to be here with you today to fight for marginalized groups. Thank you. I'd also like to recognize Kim Stanton, the Democratic Staff Director, for all of the tremendous work she's put into ensuring today's event is successful. Thank you so much, Kim. As a member of Laguna Pueblo and one of the first 2 Indigenous women elected to Congress, I'm honored to be a part of this important discussion. As one of a growing population of Indigenous leaders around the world, it's important that we share our lived experiences as Indigenous people. It's extraordinary, this time that we're in for Indigenous people. New Zealand recently appointed the nation's first Indigenous woman to the role of Minister of Foreign Affairs, signaling their recognition of Indigenous contributions to society and the inspiring impact of having a Maori voice lead international affairs. Last year, I had the distinct honor of hosting a delegation of Brazilian congresswomen to Washington, D.C. Among this group of human rights leaders was Joênia Wapichana, the first Indigenous woman elected to Brazil's Chamber of Deputies. She told me amazing stories of environmental protection, workers' rights, Indigenous rights, and Afro-Brazilian rights. We learned from each other. Through our intercultural discourse and continue to build a dialogue of power, strength, and bravery. Again, it's an extraordinary time for Indigenous leaders and people around the world. As many of you are aware, November is Native American Heritage Month. Thank you, Chairman Smith. It's a time to celebrate the rich and diverse cultures, traditions, and histories of Native people. It's also a time for us to reflect on the failures of the United States government to uphold its trust responsibilities to Indian tribes across the country. Native Americans have overcome many hardships since the onset of colonization, including federally mandated genocide and devastating federal policies, including the assimilation and removal eras. While we still strive to hold the U.S. government accountable for its broken promises, we can celebrate the resilience and contributions of Native people. Though our history on this land has been complex, we must draw on our past experiences, the abuses we've endured and obstacles we've overcome, and our present-day influence within our free and democratic nation to address the grave environmental and human rights crises in Latin America and the Caribbean. According to the World Bank, Indigenous people make up 8% of the population in Latin America, yet they disproportionately represent 14% of the poor and 17% of the extremely poor. In 2015, the Colombian government announced the establishment of the Truth Commission to pursue truth and to commit to peace and coexistence. This decree gave hope to the Indigenous and Afro-descendant populations who have suffered for many years of violence and displacement. Regrettably, the government has not fulfilled their agreement, which has perpetuated the persecution and murder of Indigenous leaders who attempt to affirm their right to their land and their culture. In Brazil, President Bolsonaro and his allies continue to side with industry interests when it comes to mining, farming, and infrastructure projects, which have led to violent attacks against Indigenous peoples. Under his leadership, the Brazilian government continues to make attempts to legitimize the theft of constitutionally protected Indigenous lands. Their proposed regulations exacerbate climate change and threaten the human rights, livelihoods, and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples within the Amazon and even in urban areas. And of course, this pandemic has only intensified the marginalization these communities face. making it far more difficult for Indigenous people to gain access to basic services, medical care, and technology. In Bolivia, protected indigenous territories cover approximately 52% of the Amazon rainforest. Despite these communities conserving the biodiversity and resources in this area with great care, their land and ways of life are under attack. Elsewhere in Bolivia, far-right officials have levied harmful anti-indigenous rhetoric and state violence toward protesters, indigenous and Afro-Bolivian groups. In Guatemala, food security and poverty continues to be a major concern among indigenous families. As a country ravaged by extreme climate and weather events, ranking 9th in the world for level of risk to the effects of climate change, our support in addressing this is the utmost importance. The fact that 58% of indigenous children suffer from chronic malnutrition and stunting effects should cause pause in all of us. These are not isolated incidences. Throughout the Americas, we witness similar stories of discrimination, oppression, and social environmental conflict affecting up to 50 million indigenous lives. Though there is much reform needed, I remain hopeful thanks to the impactful grassroots activism and ongoing support from federal and non-government organizations within the US and internationally. We've seen poverty rates of indigenous households decrease in countries like Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, and educational gaps closed for indigenous children in Ecuador and Nicaragua, largely due to the work many of you here participate in. Thank you to our panelists and many of our viewers who've dedicated their time and resources to tackling these tough issues. Over the past 20 years, our collective commitment and strategic multilateral efforts on these matters has made a tremendous impact for indigenous lives around the world. I look forward to hearing from our panel of experts and learning more about policy solutions that support indigenous communities and tribes in the Americas. Please don't hesitate to reach out to my staff any way I can help. I remain committed to defending indigenous rights and amplifying the significant impact indigenous people have on our culture, conservation efforts, and climate change. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much for your powerful statement. I want to yield to Chairman Grijalva if he has any opening remarks.
Resources Committee, Deb Howard. Thank you very much for putting this together. I think it's really important. Not only is it timely, Mr. McGovern, it is an opportunity to raise an issue that has been with us far too long, and uphold and work with this new administration toward a equitable and humanitarian approach on the part of this country of dealing with indigenous people in Latin America and the Caribbean. Each one of you has laid out the litany of difficulties and sacrifices that indigenous people are making throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. They are severe and in many instances dangerous. To stand up and support land restoration, defend environmental defenders, insisting on territorial rights. All these things have continued to make the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean for indigenous people worse. We held a hearing on climate change and Latin America and the Caribbean. And at that briefing, it became obvious that the most severe impact is on indigenous community, and that the most severe need for attention was in indigenous communities throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you very much, highlighting what's going on in Brazil, what our organization is doing, and the strategy going forward with this administration to bring some humanity and fairness and equity into the discussion, I think is all appropriate and good. And I want to congratulate the three of you for holding this. Thank you.
Okay. All right, and I know we were joined by Congressman Jackson Lee and Representative Johnson. I don't know if they're on the line now or voting, but if any, I think they're not on the line, so we will.
Well, I'm on the line, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
all right, hey, okay. Then I will yield to you if you have any opening remarks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing on the rights of indigenous people in Latin America. And I want to thank the panelists for your appearances today and your testimony. The rights of indigenous people in the Americas have long been ignored, and it's crucial that we give this issue the scrutiny that it deserves. I've had the opportunity to travel to Colombia and have worked closely with Afro-Indigenous activists, artists, and community leaders who are overwhelmingly victims of racial violence and oppression. I also continue to call for the protection of life and land for the Quilombo people of Brazil. Black, brown, and indigenous people around the globe suffer greater and longer lasting injustices. And as we build new foreign policy initiatives under the incoming Biden administration, we must prioritize uplifting these communities. And so I look forward to this discussion today. And I want to thank the witnesses again and my colleagues for being here for this very important hearing. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Is Ms. Jackson Lee on the line? Okay, I don't think she is, but she will be here at some point. So now I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. Leila Salazar Lopez is the Executive Director of Amazon Watch. She also serves on the Governing Council of the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative and the Amazon Emergency Fund, and is also a Greenpeace voting member and a Global Fund for Women Advisor in Latin America. Keith Slack is the Director of Strategy and Campaigns at Earthrights International. He previously directed Oxfam America's Extractive Industries Global Program. Milena Canales Poma is a leader of the Quiche people of the Ayacucho region of Peru and is currently the president of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Women of Peru. She has represented Indigenous women in different spaces of dialogue with the state, civil society, and other stakeholders. Leonardo A. Kripa is a descendant of the Cola people located in the northwest of Argentina and is a senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center. He was engaged in the development of the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and has represented several indigenous communities in cases before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Jolie Schwartz is the policy director for the Bank Information Center. She facilitates the monthly Tuesday group meeting co-chaired by BIC and USAID that provides a regular platform for civil society to raise concerns about multilateral development bank policies and programs directly with the United States government. And Brian Keene is the founder and board chair of Land is Life, an international coalition of indigenous peoples. He served as rapporteur for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for 2017 to 2019. It was appointed under the Obama administration as the first advisor for indigenous peoples issues for the United States Foreign Service. At this point, I yield to Ms. Salazar Lopez for opening remarks.
Let me unmute myself. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to address you today and to speak before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the United States Congress on the topic of Indigenous peoples of the Americas on behalf of Amazon Watch. I want to thank you first and foremost for all the work that you have done to uplift human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples through the commission and beyond. Thank you to the co-chairs, Representatives Smith and McGovern, for your consistent advocacy for human rights over the years. Representative McGovern, your work has extended to some of our long-standing Indigenous partners, including the UA people from Colombia, who you met with 10 years ago and immediately raised concerns about their case with the Colombian ambassador. Thank you. Representative Holland, it is with utmost respect that I address you today. I want to express my deepest gratitude for your leadership in uplifting and defending the rights of Indigenous peoples from the United States to the Amazon, and specifically for hosting the delegation of Congresswomen in February, Brazilian Congresswomen, who you mentioned in February, including Joênia Wapichana, the first Indigenous woman elected to the Brazilian parliament, as she expressed concerns about the growing threats against Indigenous peoples, the Amazon rainforest, and democracy in Brazil. For over 500 years of colonization, the rights, lives, and lands of Indigenous peoples across the Americas have been and continue to be exploited. The Amazon region is no exception. The Amazon and its peoples are in a state of emergency, and the Amazon is dangerously close to an ecological tipping point due to unprecedented fires, rampant deforestation, land grabbing, extractive industries, including oil and mining, agribusiness expansion, attacks against land defenders, and now the COVID-19 pandemic. Some important facts for you to consider, considering this emergency, is that deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon has surged 30% since President Bolsonaro took office in January 2019. The annual burning season, which shocked the world's conscience last year, has proven to be even worse this year in 2020. Fires were up 30% in October, and they have increased over 20% this year from January to November 12th. This is the highest in decades. Let me be clear, the fires that are raging throughout the Amazon are not wildfires. They are a result of wide-scale deforestation and criminal arson encouraged by systemic racism, government rhetoric, and development policies that incentivize land grabbing, human rights violations, and environmental destruction for profit by companies and investors, including the US financial industry. Last month, we released a report together with APIB, which is the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, entitled Complicity in Destruction: How Global Corporations Enable Violations of Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Brazilian Amazon, where we identified 6 major US-based financial institutions, including BlackRock, Citigroup, and JP Morgan Chase, that have invested over $18 billion in 9 companies enabling environmental and Indigenous rights violations. And these are in the industries, in sectors of mining, agribusiness, and energy. Indigenous and forest peoples are widely known as the best guardians of the forest and biodiversity, yet their lives are increasingly at risk due to land invasions by colonists, drug traffickers, and corporate interests. According to Global Witness, Latin America is the most dangerous place in the world for land and environmental defenders. 2/3 of the 212 defenders killed in 2019 were in Latin America. 33 were in the Amazon, and 90% of the deaths in Brazil occurred in the Amazon. And now to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know I just have a few more minutes or my time is almost up. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a humanitarian crisis across the Amazon, with over 1.4 million confirmed cases and over 35,000 deaths throughout the region. Of those confirmed, over 73,000 are Indigenous peoples. Many of the people who have died are elders and wisdom keepers, those who hold vast knowledge that our world desperately needs at this time. The COVID-19 pandemic is spreading exponentially into remote communities, threatening ethnocide of Indigenous peoples if immediate action is not taken. So considering these multiple crises facing the Amazon, the violations of human rights of Indigenous peoples today, it's critical that urgent action be taken to stop further destruction and uphold and advance the Indigenous rights enshrined in law, including in the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. Just some some specific recommendations to Congress. I would like to refer to a recent statement led by APIB in Brazil, endorsed by 60 organizations, including Amazon Watch, which outlined 5 emergency measures to fight deforestation. These include a multi-year moratorium on any deforestation in the Amazon, an increase in environmental enforcement and fines, an increase in legal demarcation of Indigenous and Quilombola Afro-Brazilian territories, and a strengthening of environmental enforcement agencies like IBAMA. And specifically, we encourage members of the House to take the following actions. 1, endorse the Amazon Climate Platform. 2, advocate for the protection of threatened Indigenous forest guardians and earth defenders. And 3, support financial regulation of US-based financial institutions that are currently bankrolling the destruction of the Amazon. And I would just like to close with the words of our friend and colleague and leader, Sonia Guajajara, the executive coordinator of APIB, who says, "The Amazon is on fire, putting Indigenous lives, biodiversity, and the global climate at great risk. If we lose the Amazon, we lose the fight against climate change." Indigenous peoples know and have been saying for quite some time that everything in this life is interconnected. When you destroy Mother Earth in one place, every part of the world feels this destruction. Thank you once again for the invitation to speak, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much for your excellent testimony, and I want to yield the floor to Mr. Slack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the Commission for convening this important hearing today. Earth Rights International is a human rights and environmental organization based in Washington with offices in Myanmar, Thailand, and Peru. We support Indigenous communities and organizations across Latin America by providing legal representation in defense of Indigenous rights in national courts and within the Inter-American human rights system. I'm pleased to be joined today on the panel by Melania Canales, President of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Women of Peru, with whom we have partnered on initiatives to defend Indigenous rights. In my remarks, I will offer a brief overview of the crisis of threats and violence faced by Indigenous peoples in the regions, its connection to illegal and unsustainable natural resource extraction, and recommendations for U.S. policy and congressional action. Indigenous leaders in Latin America have described the COVID-19 pandemic as a potential ethnocide, as Leila mentioned. Even before the pandemic, however, Indigenous communities faced unprecedented levels of violence and threats due to armed groups, drug trafficking, and the illegal extraction of gold, timber, palm oil, and other commodities. In Colombia now, on average, there's one mass killing occurring every other day. Rural Indigenous communities have been most directly affected by this violence. Individuals associated with remnants of the country's guerrilla and paramilitary groups frequently assassinate Indigenous leaders. These armed actors vie for control of land for themselves, for drug trafficking and illegal resource extraction, and for their partners in the economic and political elite. In April, an Indigenous leader and 3 of his family members were massacred in Cauca Department. 1 year ago, paramilitaries massacred 5 Indigenous leaders, including the local governor, also in Cauca Department. This tragedy drew international condemnation and highlighted the crisis of violence faced by Colombia's Indigenous communities. In Peru, armed actors have threatened and killed Indigenous leaders for denouncing illegal timber extraction in the Peruvian Amazon. Across the region, COVID-19 lockdowns, although important for controlling the virus, have increased risks by preventing Indigenous activists and community leaders from frequently changing their physical location, a key protection tactic. This has made these defenders, in the words of local journalists, quote, sitting ducks for those who seek to do them harm. Even as the pandemic has raged, environmental damage to Indigenous communities has not stopped. In April, one of the worst oil spills in decades occurred in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in which 15,000 barrels of oil gushed into the Coca River from a pipeline owned by Petroecuador. eventually affecting 150,000 people. In the Peruvian Amazon, more than 470 oil spills have occurred in the last 20 years, impacting more than 40 indigenous communities. Despite this environmental record, oil companies continue to seek access to indigenous territories in the Amazon and elsewhere in the region, and have sought to use the pandemic as a pretext for weakening environmental and social protection measures, including the requirement of prior consultation. The COVID-19 pandemic is not the only global crisis threatening the existence of indigenous peoples. As Leila mentioned, the other is climate change. As defenders of the world's last tropical rainforest, indigenous peoples are also defenders of the global climate. Governments must respect and strengthen indigenous autonomy over critical rainforest areas and respect their knowledge of sustainable resource management. The Amazon rainforest in particular represents one of the last frontiers of extractable fossil fuels. Indigenous peoples have a right to say no to this extraction and to protect the rainforests on which their livelihoods depend. This point was echoed by Pope Francis earlier this year, in an official Catholic Church statement. On a positive note, next year, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights will hear the case of Colombia's Uwa people against the Colombian government more than 20 years after the case was originally filed. The Uwa are seeking recognition of their land rights vis-a-vis the presence oil companies. A successful outcome in this case would set an important precedent for Colombia and other governments in the region to respect indigenous land rights, which is an increasingly important mechanism for protecting the global climate. I'd like to conclude my remarks today with some specific recommendations for the US Congress and Biden administration. First, as members of the Commission are aware, and as Leila mentioned, Latin America is the deadliest region in the world for human rights defenders, especially indigenous peoples and others who are defending land and the environment. The US Congress and Biden administration should continue to work to ensure that human rights protection bodies in countries including Colombia and Honduras are responding adequately to threats against indigenous peoples and other environmental land defenders. Second, on a more systematic level, the US State Department, either on its own accord or through a congressional mandate, should develop comprehensive global guidelines to ensure that diplomatic missions prioritize the protection of human rights defenders, including indigenous and land and environmental defenders. While the US government has taken important steps in this area, including the creation of an interagency working group on environmental land defenders, responses from US embassies have been inconsistent. These guidelines would provide clear procedures for US diplomatic missions and to support defenders at risk, while also providing greater clarity for defenders themselves and how to approach the US government for support. Third and finally, and also on a systematic level, Congress should adopt legislation that further strengthens corporate accountability for human rights violations, particularly in the extractive and agribusiness sectors, potentially in a manner similar to what exists now for corporate corruption under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. US Congress should make clear that corporations implicated either directly or via their supply chains in grave human rights abuses, including those committed against indigenous peoples, will be held legally accountable for their actions. I thank the Commission again for its attention to this critical issue and welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. So we have a vote going on right now, and I just want to check with Mr. Smith and Ms. Holland. I'm in the Capitol, so I can run down and vote within like 5 minutes. I don't know whether you guys can wait 5 minutes so we don't have to interrupt the hearing. Is that?
I can vote in 5 minutes too, Chairman.
All right.
I can run over there.
So Mr. Smith, can you just stay here until we come back? We'll keep it going.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I will now yield to Melania Canales Poma.
Alimpuncho, Alimpuncho, Yapayayquichita, Sutrimi Melania Canales Poma, presidenta de la Organización Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas, Andinas y Amazónicas del Perú. Asimismo, también coordinadora de la región sur del Enlace Continental de Mujeres Indígenas de las Américas. Somos organización defensora de nuestra madre tierra, de nuestra Pachamama, así como de nuestros derechos colectivos e individuales, que es como el derecho individual y colectivo es como una moneda de dos caras, inseparables.
Good day to all of you. My
Eh,
name is Melania Canales Poma, president of the ONAMIAP. We are defenders of our Mother Earth, our Pachamama, as well as our collective and individual rights, which is like a two-sided coin that is inseparable.
Como es cosa sabida, los proyectos extractivistas, minería e hidrocarburos, asimismo la gran agricultura que se siembra extensivamente, que destruye bosques y contamina ríos con químicas a nuestros territorios y están siendo instaladas en América Latina y en este caso en Perú, que al cruzarse con variables como del género y la pertenencia étnica, se acentúan más las desigualdades y la vulneración de los derechos de las mujeres indígenas, fortaleciéndose más la violencia racista y machista.
As it is well known, the extractivist projects, mining, hydrocarbons, and agriculture that are installed in Latin America and in Peru, when intersected with variables such as gender and ethnicity, increase inequalities and accentuate the violation of rights of indigenous women and further strengthen racist and sexist violence.
El modelo económico y político se basa en la mercantilización y explotación desenfrenada de la madre naturaleza. En América Latina se ha profundizado a partir de las décadas de los 90 debido al incremento de los precios de algunos minerales en el mercado internacional.
The economic and political model based on the commodification and exploitation of Mother Nature. In Latin America, this issue has deepened since the decade of the 90s due to an increase in the prices of some minerals in the international markets.
Son múltiples y diversas las formas de desigualdad y de violencia a las que nos enfrentamos las mujeres indígenas en estos contextos, las cuales muchas veces son ejercidas por los gobiernos, promoviendo el etnocidio y el genocidio, así como las estilizaciones forzadas que hasta hoy en día ninguna sanción. Y asimismo, también esta violencia es ejercida, bueno, en nuestras comunidades, por nuestros familiares, por nuestras parejas e incluso por parte de otras mujeres. Las violencias que nos afectan a nuestra vida es desde la salud física y mental, también de lo económico, laboral, también organizativo. Sufrimos violencia de las organizaciones mixtas, también habitacional, educativo, porque no tenemos las mismas posibilidades las mujeres indígenas de acceder a una educación de calidad, etc. O sea, afecta a nuestros derechos individuales y colectivos.
These are multiple and diverse forms of inequality and violence that indigenous women face in this context, which are often exercised by governments, like the case of forced sterilizations, by our communities, by our family members, by our partners, and even by other women. The violence that affects our lives covers a wide spectrum, from physical and mental to economic, labor, organizational, domestic, educational, etc. In other words, it affects our individual and collective rights.
Nos enfrentamos al machismo en nuestras comunidades cuando los hombres intentan invisibilizar nuestras propuestas y nuestros aportes, así como monopolizar la participación y la toma de decisiones con respecto a nuestros territorios. El extractivismo viene destruyendo, contaminando nuestras tierras que ya no producen y no garantizan la seguridad y la soberanía alimentaria. Asimismo, nuestros ríos, que eran la fuente de alimentación a través de la pesca, han sido contaminados. Y la extinción de los peces de la misma forma. No hay agua segura para el consumo humano, animal y para el riego de cultivos, por la presencia de relaves mineros, derrames petroleros. Asimismo, estos han afectado la salud de nuestros niños y niñas, con metales pesados en la sangre. Y esto se suma la violencia extractiva que los gobiernos imponen con sangre y fuego. Estas actividades en nuestros territorios colectivos y que vienen despojándonos de forma legal e ilegal, ¿no? de nuestros territorios para el beneficio de un grupo de poder económico.
We face machismo in our communities. When men try to make our proposals and contributions invisible, as well as monopolizing participation and decision-making in relation to our territories. Extractivism has been destroying and polluting our lands, which no longer produce and no longer guarantee food security and sovereignty. Our rivers, which were the source of food for fishing, have been polluted as well, impacting the fish and a safe water source for human and animal consumption, as well as for irrigation. The presence of mining tailings and oil spills have also affected the health of our children, with heavy metals in their blood. To this, the extractive violence is added. Governments imposing extractive activities with blood and fire in our collective territories, which they take from us legally, but also illegally, to benefit a group of economic power.
Actualmente, como organización indígena, venimos promoviendo una ley, el derecho de la madre naturaleza, que para los pueblos indígenas, nuestra madre naturaleza tiene vida y que debe ser reconocidas también como sujeto de derecho, y que debemos reflexionar nuestro antropocentrismo para una vida de armonía, reciprocidad y equilibrio con la madre naturaleza y el ser humano, sabiendo que todo lo que nos afecta a los seres humanos también afecta a la madre naturaleza, y lo que le afecta a la madre naturaleza nos afecta también al ser humano. Además, pensar en las futuras generaciones, dejando a un lado nuestro egoísmo y ambiciones como seres mortales.
Currently, as an indigenous organization, we have been promoting the law of the rights of Mother Earth. Because for indigenous peoples, Mother Earth is alive, therefore must be considered as a subject of the law. We must reflect on our anthropocentrism for a life in harmony, reciprocity, and balance with Mother Nature and human beings, knowing that everything that affects Mother Earth will also affect humans, as well as thinking about future generations, leaving our selfishness and ambitions as mortal beings.
Asimismo, como organización de mujeres indígenas, tenemos el firme propósito de promover procesos de cambio hacia el buen vivir, y este inicio significa también una asamblea constituyente, popular, soberana, plurinacional y paritaria. Y este proceso debe ser de abajo hacia arriba, y no solo hecho por un grupo de poder económico que impone su hegemonía.
In the same manner, as an organization of indigenous women, we have the firm intention of promoting processes of change towards good living. And this begins by means of a constitutional assembly, popular, sovereign, plurinational, and equal. This process must be made from the bottom up, and not only done by a group of economic power that imposes its hegemony.
En esta pandemia hemos podido ver transparentemente las grandes brechas de desigualdad. a pesar de que nuestros países son exportadores de minerías y otros. Dicen que somos un país de renta media y que económicamente estamos bien, pero sin embargo, los derechos a salud, educación, comunicación y otros solo son discursos y en letras, porque realmente los derechos son un negocio y son un privilegio que la gran mayoría no tenemos esas posibilidades de acceso a una salud, por ejemplo, de calidad. Menos las mujeres indígenas, históricamente racializadas, discriminadas, colonizadas, inferiorizadas y despojadas de nuestros derechos colectivos e individuales, como el derecho al territorio y la participación efectiva y activa, así como a la consulta previa, a nuestras propias formas de desarrollo, con nuestros propios conocimientos, saberes y prácticas ancestrales, a nuestra autonomía y libre determinación. Como mujeres indígenas en resistencia, solo buscamos el buen vivir, defendiendo a la madre naturaleza para las futuras generaciones, sabiendo que somos pasajeras en esta vida.
In this pandemic, we have been able to see transparently there are large inequality gaps, despite the fact that our mineral exporting countries and others say that we are a middle income country and that we are economically well. But nevertheless, the rights to health, education, communication, and others exist only in speech and in documents, because rights are really a business for the privileged ones, and the vast majority does not have possibilities to obtain them. Even more so for Indigenous women. Historically racialized, discriminated against, colonized, belittled, and stripped of our collective and individual rights, such as the rights to a collective territory, to effective and active participation, to our own form of development, our own knowledge, to our autonomy and self-determination. As Indigenous women in resistance, we only seek a good living and to defend Mother Nature for future generations, knowing that we are transient.
Bueno, las mujeres indígenas también vemos el territorio de forma integral. El territorio es un todo, no solo es la Amazonía, ni solo los Andes, ni solo la costa como los mares. No es bueno separar esto y pensar en una sola parte del cuerpo humano, porque si nos duele un dedo, afecta a todo el cuerpo. Es por eso que las mujeres indígenas siempre pensamos el territorio de forma integral. Lo que le pasa en la Amazonía, le pasa en los Andes y le pasa también en la costa, en los mares. Y lo que pasa en los mares, en la costa o en los Andes, también le pasa en la Amazonía esta destrucción. Y creo que es importante pensar de forma integral. Muchas gracias.
It is important to think in a comprehensive way. In nature, like in our bodies, things do not happen in isolation. Whatever affects the coastal region, the highlands, or the rainforest will eventually affect the whole territory. I would like to thank you very much for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you very much. I would now like to yield to Mr. Kripa.
Distinguished members of Congress, my clients, including the Guatemalan native community that I work for, are people that believe in law as a means to achieve lasting changes for their lives and for future generations. The goal they seek, their number one priority, has always been the same: achieve full legal security over the lands that they collectively possess in a traditional and public manner. They have a distinctive spiritual and material relationship with their lands, which they hope to continue to hold by achieving legal security. They want to stay on their lands, not to migrate to capital cities, nor to the United States. This is particularly true for my current client, the Maya Quechí Agua Caliente community in Guatemala, and I believe it is true for all other native communities in the country. My client is at the forefront of a legal fight to secure land and natural resource rights in a procedure before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica. This case demonstrates the vulnerability of Guatemala's land survey, titling, and registry agencies and procedures. This land insecurity is especially true of collectively held indigenous lands and any other lands subject to mining interest. This is not an isolated case. On the contrary, it reflects major problems that almost all native communities and tribes face when seeking legal security over the lands in Guatemala. For more than 45 years, Agua Caliente has been subject to a land titling procedure that has failed to result in a final land title. In 1974, the community filed a land claim asking for a state-issued land title over their collectively held lands. In 1985, the state did issue a provisional title, which would become final after a number of payments are made. In 2002, Agua Caliente completed those payments. In so doing, the community fulfilled all applicable legal requirements in order to receive the land title. Unwarranted delays in issuing the title forced the Agua Caliente community to seek judicial protection in 2009, and 2 years later, the Constitutional Court, a major court in Guatemala, issued a major decision ordering the land titling agency to issue without further delays the land title. Instead of issuing the final title, various government agencies have blocked it. The following examples that I am going to mention reflect their actions and a state that neither respects the rule of law nor extends equality before the law to indigenous peoples when there are mining interests at play. First, the Guatemalan Registry of Deeds allowed the removal of registry pages that proved Agua Caliente's 1985 provisional title. This page removal prevents titling from moving forward. Secondly, in 2004, the Ministry of Mining and Energy awarded a permit to explore and exploit subsurface resources located on Agua Caliente lands to the Guatemalan Nickel Company, a private sector company and a subsidiary of the Solway Investment Group based in Switzerland. Thirdly, the Land Survey Agency allowed a boundary marker to be relocated from its original and rightful location, creating a major overlap with the nickel mining project area. The overlap affects Agua Caliente and other 15 Maya Quechí communities in Izabal, Guatemala. Last but not least, since 2002, the Land Titling Agency refuses not only to take actions to restore the removed registry pages necessary to be able to issue the final land title, but also refuses to comply with the 2011 Constitutional Court decision. Last year's Civil Court of Appeals resolution confirmed such non-compliance with the court decision and ordered the Land Titling Agency to immediately issue the land title. Distinguished members of Congress, as the former UN Special Rapporteur Rodolfo Stavenhagen once said, mining permits exclude indigenous populations settled within or around project areas from the use of their natural resources. They do not take into account the impact on the needs of these communities, nor include solutions to such impacts. In Guatemala, indigenous peoples, communities, and tribes are afforded no right whatsoever to natural resources pertaining to their lands, whether those resources are surface or subsurface resources. No law recognizes their right to participate in the management of the resources or benefit from the exploitation or commercial development of these resources. Other countries in the Western Hemisphere do recognize these rights by law, and even multilateral development banks have indigenous peoples' policies that mandate that borrowing countries implement safeguard measures to fulfill these rights. Guatemala is one of them. As a result, indigenous peoples are being pushed away from their collectively held lands to pave the way for mining activities. In 2018, as a result of a hearing held by the Guatemalan Congress Transparency Commission, all the government agencies mentioned before recognized the land overlap in question. Shockingly, a year later, last year, these same agencies proposed that the 16 communities affected by the mining project be relocated as a means to remedy the overlap in favor of the mining company, which plans to start exploiting subsurface resources located in these lands. Distinguished members of Congress, based on the above, I respectfully recommend the following actions to ensure that Indigenous peoples are afforded equality before the law in Guatemala and that they be given a fair chance to be development partners, not development casualties. 1, provide financial support to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, especially to its special rapporteurship on the rights of Indigenous peoples. This is the last legal resort that communities, such as Aguacaliente, have when there is no rule of law in their home countries. 2, ensure that U.S. financial contribution to multilateral development banks support land administration projects in Guatemala, with a focus on achieving major changes in Guatemala's program of surveying, titling, and registering collectively held Indian lands. And finally, in order to contribute to Guatemala's much-needed law reform, share knowledge and lessons learned from the United States federal Indian law, in particular, those legal principles relating to self-government and natural resource rights. Thank you for your time and your consideration of these very important matters.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shores.
Co-Chair McGovern, Congresswoman Holland, Co-Chair Smith, and members of the Commission, good morning and thank you for the opportunity to testify today and to present the Bank Information Center's reflections on over 30 years of supporting and accompanying Indigenous communities and activists in their advocacy toward the international financial institutions. We appreciate the continued leadership of this Commission in driving reform at the IFIs to ensure their policies and programs protect and respect human rights. Despite significant developments in international law over the last 30 years that have affirmed and recognized the rights of Indigenous peoples, IFIs continue to finance projects and programs that harm Indigenous communities in Latin America and around the world. In response to pressure from the U.S. government, civil society, and Indigenous communities, the institutions have adopted policies and practices meant to avoid and mitigate risks of their projects on Indigenous peoples. But they often fall short of what is required under international law and have failed to protect the rights of many communities. One of the most egregious examples of a project funded by both the World Bank Group and Inter-American Development Bank that led to gross violations of Indigenous rights was the Chixoy Dam in Guatemala. In that case, hundreds of people from the Rio Negro community were brutally massacred in 1982 by the Guatemalan military for their opposition to the dam. While policies and practices of the institutions have evolved since Chixoy, there have been dozens of other instances over the years in which projects financed by the World Bank and IDB have overlooked, ignored, or contributed to violations of human rights. In 2013, the private sector arm of the IDB invested in 2 hydroelectric plants in the Esquisas microregion in Guatemala. The construction of the projects led to the destruction of Indigenous Mayan sacred and ceremonial sites, murders and criminalization of Indigenous authorities, pollution of water sources, and serious impacts on Indigenous women in particular that were not assessed prior to the project's approval. The communities have filed a case with the IDB's Independent Accountability Mechanism, the MICI, and are currently awaiting its final report to assess whether the institution's policies related to Indigenous people and gender were violated. In 2016, the World Bank approved an $800 million loan to Colombia weeks after it signed a peace agreement to end the internal conflict with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. The loan was provided as a development policy loan aimed at supporting the country's commitment to addressing long-standing issues around territorial planning. As a DPL, there were no requirements for assessing specific risks to Indigenous peoples or to consult them on how they would participate in project design or implementation. As of 2018, there was no evidence that Indigenous communities had benefited from the project. Most requests for collective land titling had stagnated, and there were no clear institutional mechanisms for communities to even raise complaints. Another recent investment in a transmission line in Panama by the private sector arm of the World Bank, the IFC, poses serious risks to Indigenous peoples and their environment. Communities have raised objections to consultations around the project, arguing that these have not been sufficient and that their free, prior, and informed consent has not been obtained. Yet the government of Panama has moved forward with the bidding process for the project. There have been significant improvements to the policies of the World Bank Group and IDB over the years, many of which were spurred by cases like the Chicxulub Dam. However, policies are not always implemented well, and for some lending instruments, they do not even apply. Furthermore, there is a tendency on the part of the institutions to commit to applying lessons learned to future projects, while failing to provide remedy to communities harmed by the mistakes of the past. In order to begin to fill the gaps in policy and practice, as well as to provide a path to remedy, the U.S. government and Congress should urge the World Bank Group and IDB to adopt the following reforms. First, policies meant to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples must be rigorously implemented throughout the project cycle. Second, protections for Indigenous peoples must extend to all lending instruments, including development policy loans, which we know will be heavily relied upon by the World Bank in its response to COVID-19. Third, IFIs must develop clear guidance and procedures for how to address reprisals against people who raise concerns or oppose projects in ways that respect the rights and customs of Indigenous peoples. And finally, as the preeminent development finance institution focused on the private sector, the IFC should establish a framework for remedial action with opportunities for communities who were harmed by legacy projects financed by the World Bank Group to benefit from it. The U.S. government, with support and urging from Congress, has historically been the most vocal supporter and champion of strong environmental and social standards at the institution. And it is responsible for creating much of the architecture around those standards, as well as the mechanisms that should be enforcing them. In order to ensure the systems protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, the U.S. must now show strong leadership in urging these key reforms to be made at both the World Bank Group and the IDB. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. Lastly, I'm going to yield to Mr. Keene. And let me just, for the record, I think when I introduced you originally, I said that you were the Obama administration's first advisor for Indigenous peoples issues for the United States Foreign Service. I meant to say first advisor for Indigenous peoples issues for United States Foreign Assistance. And so I just wanted to make sure the record was accurate. But I want to welcome you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Representative McGovern, and all of the distinguished representatives who are here today. It's both an honor and a privilege to be given the opportunity to present testimony to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. So as you've heard from my colleagues, and as all of you seem to be very well aware, throughout the Americas, Indigenous peoples are under assault. They're being forcibly evicted from their territories, deprived of their resources. Their livelihoods are being decimated. They're labeled by governments as terrorists for speaking up about the abuses their communities suffer. And they're threatened, targeted for violence, and assassinated. Companies, including American companies, engage in the activities that are at the heart of this assault: mining, oil extraction, industrial agriculture, logging, and large-scale mega projects like dams and roads. In carrying out these projects, these companies are often supported by policies of oppression, a country's military, or paramilitary groups. This situation is not unique to the Americas. Indigenous peoples around the world are confronting the same threats and abuses, often perpetrated by the same actors. Despite this pattern of assault, Indigenous peoples continue to contribute tremendously to global development, to global food security, to conflict resolution. Indigenous peoples are on the front lines in efforts to protect forests and other critical ecosystems, to safeguard biological diversity, to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of global climate change. They have a pivotal role to play in creating a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world. And the Biden-Harris administration, as well as the incoming Congress, should take the necessary actions to engage them as equals in this endeavor. The state of affairs for Indigenous peoples in the Americas, for Indigenous peoples around the world, is crisis. It is my hope that the 117th Congress will create a working group on Indigenous peoples to cooperate with the incoming Biden administration to take the type of bold and visionary actions that are necessary to address this crisis and to put into practice the ideals that are expressed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, both at home and abroad. So I've divided my recommendations into three groupings. I have more recommendations than the other speakers, but I echo their recommendations also. Many of my recommendations do not only apply to the Americas, because this is a global issue, and the way that the United States government can really have an impact is by making systemic changes. So first, we must continue to reform United States foreign assistance. The United States should be implementing a development model that is based on human rights, a model that, with regard to Indigenous peoples, recognizes and respects the right to self-determination and embraces a standard of free, prior, and informed consent. Indigenous peoples are not simply passive recipients of development, they are active participants with their own visions of what development looks like. Their traditional knowledge, their ways of living, and their land and resource management strategies are vital to building resilient societies, ensuring global food security, and enhancing sustainable economic growth. And they should be engaged as partners through their own social, political, and legal institutions in the development process. So under this basket of reforming U.S. foreign assistance, my recommendations are that first, President Biden should nominate a Secretary of State and leaders at the United States Agency for International Development, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, who will demonstrate a commitment to promoting, defending, and advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. Second, ensure full implementation of USAID's policy on promoting the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples, and mandate that this policy be implemented also in large regional projects in Latin America, or we have the Alliance for Prosperity that really impacts Indigenous peoples, and we need to implement a policy that recognizes that and that. And then in Africa, we have projects like Power Africa, Prosper Africa, and the Central Africa Regional Program for the Environment, which are spending hundreds of millions of dollars without adequate participation of Indigenous peoples. The U.S. government should develop similar policies for every government agency and department that is involved in U.S. foreign assistance, including the military, so that every taxpayer-funded program or project that impacts the lives, territories, resources, or livelihoods of Indigenous peoples respects their right to self-determination, adheres to the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and engages them as partners in project design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. USAID funding that is specifically for the self-determined development of Indigenous peoples should be increased significantly, with a priority on legalization of their land and resource rights. There should be an effort to convene the governments of the Amazon Basin and the Gran Chaco with the aim of fostering the creation of intangible zones and buffer zones to ensure the protection of Indigenous peoples who are living in voluntary isolation. And then I would echo the recommendations of Jolie, and that the U.S. use the voice and vote of the U.S. government to strengthen implementation of World Bank and Regional Development Bank Indigenous peoples policies. And I would add to that that the U.S. should initiate a process within the African Development Bank to develop a policy on Indigenous peoples. Second, the Biden administration should meaningfully engage or re-engage international human rights mechanisms and international political fora to ensure the respect and protection for Indigenous peoples' rights in the United States and around the world. And that means fully participating in the United Nations Human Rights Council and all of the UN human rights treaty bodies, engaging the 4 UN mechanisms that are specifically there to address Indigenous peoples' rights: the Permanent Forum, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples. And the U.S. should provide funding to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. The United States should ratify International Labor Organization Convention 169, along with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The U.S. should recognize and support the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we should work to make Indigenous peoples' issues a standing agenda item at the UN Security Council. And lastly, because the United States is part of the Americas, the United States must get its own house in order. The current administration has done real harm to the relationship between U.S. government and Indigenous peoples in the United States. The Biden administration and the 117th Congress must work to restore government-to-government relations with tribes, honor its treaty and trust obligations, and promote tribal sovereignty and self-determination. In its first 100 days in office, I believe the Biden administration should strive to draft a national action plan for implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, halt all energy and infrastructure development, including the seismic permitting and lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and secure permanent protection for the coastal plain of the refuge. They should also secure permanent protection for Mount Ikea, Beers Airs National Monument, and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. They should announce that they will be resuming the annual White House Tribal Nations Conference as were held during the Obama-Biden administration. The incoming administration should re-engage and revitalize the Trilateral Working Group on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls, which is a working group that we started with Canada and Mexico during the Obama administration. The Biden administration should appoint a Native American as Secretary of Interior. And finally, the Biden administration should pardon and free Leonard Peltier. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you. Before we get to questions, I know my colleague Sheila Jackson-Lee has come online, and I don't know if she has an opening statement before we go to questions.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an opening statement very briefly, though. Let me thank you very much for this very crucial hearing. Tom Lantos, Human Rights Commission, is again focusing on the issues that sometimes are not highlighted as they should. As I was listening to the last speaker, I think it is extremely important as we move into the new administration that there be an enormous and important emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, and particularly the issues that have been discussed. I simply want to say the rights of Indigenous people are human rights, and human rights are the rights of Indigenous people. I know that we in the United States hear often about natural disasters. As a border state, Texas, we have welcomed people from Guatemala and Peru and obviously Mexico and beyond during the incidences of natural disasters. But the question of human rights, the taking of land, the destruction of the rainforests, the lack of resources, human resources for the Indigenous people first on the land is something that is long overdue. And what I think particularly of as the chairperson of the Children's Caucus is what we're doing for children alongside of human rights, and how the rights of children are diminished by the treatment of their family, the land, and of course, resources distributed to them. Let me finish by saying that human rights also equals to the rights of democracy, freedom of religion, freedom of access, and freedom of speech, and freedom to be heard and to be represented in the governments of the respective countries. And all of that, I think, should be issues that we should be concerned with as part of our foreign policy, as part of our congressional legislative record. And I look forward to being able to ask questions, Mr. Chairman, pointedly on some of these issues. With that, I ask unanimous consent to have my statement submitted into the record, and I yield back.
Without objection. Let me begin. I'll be very brief because I know we have a lot of members on the call here. But you know, the issues we're talking about right now are urgent, right? I mean, indigenous communities are being wiped out, land is being developed, and it's happening now. It's happening quickly. And I appreciate all the recommendations with regard to the World Bank, other international institutions upholding treaties and agreements that the world community supposedly has endorsed. But it seems to me that, from a U.S. perspective, there are kind of two ways to approach this. One is, that we use the force of our diplomacy to compel people like Bolsonaro in Brazil that we strongly object to his further eroding and destroying indigenous communities and his quest toward deforestation. I think on the diplomatic side, there's much more that an administration can do to make it known that this is a serious matter for the United States and that we care very deeply about it. Then there's another way, and as we were talking about deforestation here, I kept on thinking of the blood diamonds model, where we, went and looked at, supply chains and said, we're not going to tolerate any of these diamonds, that have been extracted the way these so-called blood diamonds were into the market, and we're going to basically, try to, eliminate the economic benefit for the extraction of those diamonds. Is the blood diamonds model applicable to deforestation? I mean, is that something that that we should be looking to pursue, as one of the many levers in trying to deal with this issue? And I open it up to anybody who wants to answer that.
I'd be happy to begin.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. And I think yes. And interestingly enough, a few years ago, we did some research on the export of Amazon crude from the Amazon. As many of my colleagues mentioned, industrial extraction, oil and mining is one of the significant causes of harm and violations of Indigenous peoples' rights and territories. Oil from the Amazon, the majority of the oil that it's extracted from the Amazon comes to the United States. And much of it, over 50% of it, comes to my home state of California. And so a couple years ago, we did some research on the exports, and that's exactly what we said. We said we need to look at crude oil from the Amazon and commodities, these commodities from the Amazon that are causing so much harm, similar to how we see blood diamonds, right? They're causing that much harm. They're causing destruction of the environment, destruction of the climate, and violations of human rights. So actually, in the climate platform that I mentioned, one of the things, my daughter really wants me to make her braids right now. Hold on a second. We're good at multitasking. I'll just end by saying that, we are talking about supply chains and financial portfolios that are free of deforestation and fossil fuels. This is one of the things that we really need to be looking at.
Right. And I hope it's up to anyone else, but I mean, this commission has done a lot of work with human rights abuses in China, especially how China treats the Uyghur population. And, we have issued, resolutions of condemnation. We have, tried all kinds of ways to persuade China to stop its persecution of Uyghurs, but we just we moved forward with a bill that really goes after the supply chain, basically saying that, that we will not entertain in our markets any products that were made by essentially slave labor. Because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these countries are trampling on the rights of indigenous communities, are engaged in deforestation because they think they can make money. I remember in 20, it was 2016, I was in Ecuador and I met with President Correa of Ecuador, and we raised this issue of the Amazon and the protection of the indigenous communities, and his response to me was, well, we have to make well, we have to support our people, and the only way we can do that is by moving in this direction, or the international community can recognize the value of the Amazon, and provide us assistance so that we do not develop those areas. But anybody else want to comment? Schwartz? Yeah, well, I'll go Ms. Schwartz and Mr. Slack and anybody else. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Congressman. It's an excellent question, and I think in some ways both of those strategies come together in U.S. government's engagement in multilateral institutions. On the one hand, you have the opportunities for diplomacy there. You're working side by side with both donor countries and borrowing countries to develop the best policies, the best practices, and financing certain types of projects. But you also have the ability to pull back to really problematic areas, to preventing institutions from supporting problematic investments, and then up to Treasury, especially as a lead U.S. government agency, to really think about how to use both of those strategies in their engagement with multilateral development banks.
Mr. Slack?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would say two things. One is the diplomacy is extremely important. Using the diplomatic tools that the United States has to put pressure on countries to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. I would say including human rights diplomacy. So including all of the human rights mechanisms that we have, the human rights department at the State Department, human rights officers within U.S. embassies, making sure that they are focusing on indigenous rights issues in particular and taking action to support indigenous defenders. On your second question about the blood diamonds model, I think, yes, strengthening U.S. regulations and enforcement of U.S. regulations against the importation of illegally produced wood, for example, or timber products, and also illegally mined gold, which is used for money laundering, is finding its way into smelters and other operations in the United States. All of that is contributing dramatically to the repression and violence against indigenous peoples who are on the land they're on the land that is desired by the illegal extractive operations. So cutting off their ability to export that material, which is produced illegally, into the United States, using the mechanism that we have and making them stronger, strengthening enforcement, increasing the resources we have so that none of that stuff can get from these indigenous areas into the United States, and therefore cutting off an important export route that they might have.
And maybe we can work with you, because I'm interested in looking at legislation using the blood diamonds model when it comes to the issues of indigenous rights and deforestation in particular, because I think that in addition to diplomacy, in addition to focusing more on indigenous rights in terms of our human rights policy and our influence with a lot of the international organizations, I think that it's another powerful tool, right, to see if we can kind of reverse the trends here. Just before I yield to Ms. Holland, does anybody any other comments from anybody on the panel before Mr. Keene?
Yeah, I would just add that it is a good model to use, diplomacy, and also we should think about, like, there's talk of free trade agreements with Brazil. Those kind of things should not go forward without real improvements on the ground. And we should also be thinking about the IFC, which funds a lot of these, or many of these things. They've recently, well, in the last few years, been funding cattle ranching in the Chaco, an area that's the highest deforestation rate in the world, slave labor, land grabbing. And they just went ahead and gave these big loans to support the cattle ranching there, which has proven to be contribute to the problem. So we need to really look at how we vote on these things in the international financial institutions as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and as you know, there are powerful financial interests in the United States that don't want us to be focusing on these questions that we're focusing on right now. Before I yield to Ms. Holland, does anyone else have anything else they want to add to this? Ms. Canales. And Mr. Creeper, Ms. Canales and Mr. Creeper, yeah.
Bien, una de las cosas que hay que tener presente que la minería y el petróleo realmente destruye el territorio. Y creo que tiene que haber cambio en el modelo económico, extractiva. Queremos una economía sostenible y solidaria, que lo extractivo no tiene casi nada de ello, ¿no? Y asimismo nos gustaría que la nueva administración también de Estados Unidos pueda tener la tarea de fortalecer el derecho también del territorio colectivo. Ese es el derecho colectivo de pueblos indígenas y de mujeres indígenas, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que esa es una tarea importante que se debería impulsar. Muchas gracias.
Well, mining and oil are destroying our lands. We need to change the model. We want a model that is sustainable and fair. And we would like to ask the new administration to strengthen collective rights for communities and for women.
And Mr. Creeper, you wanted to add?
Yes, thank you, Congressman McGovern. I agree with everything that was suggested by the previous speakers. I do believe, though, that strong bilateral engagement by the United States with countries where indigenous peoples are under attack is critical. One example is Brazil. Another example is Guatemala, Peru, Colombia. There is a need in these countries to change the law so that indigenous peoples' rights to their collective lands and natural resources are protected and respected. Otherwise, changing corporate responsibility will not be achievable because corporations will have to respect the law in the country, and when there is no legal protection of those lands and resources, there won't be any change in corporate behavior. Thanks.
No, and I think that's a great point. And look, I'll just end with this. I think we are entering a new phase when it comes not just to the rights of the indigenous communities, but where human rights is going to be elevated again as a centerpiece of our foreign policy. But I can just tell you this: the people on this commission, Ms. Holland, Mr. Grijalva, Ms. Jackson Lee, and others, Mr. Smith, others here. I mean, we are. We feel very strongly about this. And so we are going to make sure our voices are heard with the new incoming administration, that these are priority matters. And I really appreciate your recommendations here. I will now yield to Ms. Holland.
Thank you so much, Chairman. And thank you all for your amazing and heartfelt and really disturbing also testimony. I appreciate so much all the work that all of you have done and continue to do. I had some questions, but now I'm wondering, after all of your testimony, I mean, I pay particular attention to Brazil, and Joenia Wapichana and I, we wrote an op-ed. She came here, we've been in contact, we've had a few phone calls together. What are the chances? I mean, I feel like we need more Indigenous people in leadership positions. We need them at the table to be able to speak on these issues right there at the table. And I guess what I'm wondering is if any of you would like to comment on how we change the political atmosphere, how we get more Indigenous people into office, how do we, bring up the level of voter participation in these countries. I watched in horror as President Bolsonaro won his election, because you could see very easily that it was going to be a death sentence for so many indigenous people and for the rainforest. And so if any of you would like to comment on that, the politics of this and how we get more people into office and get them to have a stronger voice in these issues, I'd love to hear your ideas about that. Mr. Keene, you can start out.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that there are plenty of very strong indigenous leaders around the world that you know are leaders in their own processes, their own political systems. And I think one thing that's important, which I tried to sort of lay out in my recommendations about foreign assistance, is that our foreign assistance should be supporting these leaders and these leadership systems that indigenous peoples have, bringing them to the table. The table's there, the leaders are there, they're just not invited to the table. The same with another way we can increase indigenous leadership is the Biden administration should not only say rejoin the Paris Agreement, but we should rejoin the Paris Agreement and support creating a space at the table there for indigenous peoples. And the same with other international agreements, with our free trade agreements. We need to invite them to the table. The leaders are there. We just need to create that space for them to be able to speak as part of these processes.
Can I add something?
Yes, please, Ms.
I was just on a, well, there were elections in Brazil this weekend, and I'm just, you know, we all needed some good news, I just have to say. And I was really hopeful on Monday after talking to one of my colleagues in Brazil who reported that a lot of the candidates that were backed by Bolsonaro lost. Mm-hmm. And many indigenous people were elected to office. 21 indigenous councilors and 2 mayors were elected in Brazil on Sunday. So wonderful. I think the tide is turning. You know, this is a positive sign. And these are elected leaders, right? As Brian mentioned as well, you know, there are leaders, you know, elected or unelected, that are leading the way for indigenous-led solutions that our planet, our people desperately need at this time.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ms. Schwartz?
Thank you. You know, it's a great question. This is one of the reasons that we push so hard for the right to self-determination, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and other aspects of international human rights law to be deeply integrated and robustly implemented in the policies of multilateral development banks that are financing a lot of these problematic projects, because that is, you know, if we can push for this at all different levels, including, you know, through the political processes that Layla was just speaking for, we need to push it. We need to push these things at all levels, at every level of U.S. government engagement. And so, you know, making sure that these rights are deeply entrenched into those policies and that the U.S. government takes a leadership role in making sure they're implemented. That is how to make sure that people have a voice in the development process, that leaders and their own processes and systems, as Brian was mentioning, are what helps to determine the development of those communities. That is really a key way that the U.S. can support exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kripa, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Deborah Holland. I think the question that you make is very important for our countries in the region. And I would like to say that I think strengthening the participation of indigenous political leaders in decision-making is critical. There are some examples in the region, and I would like to highlight a few. One is, for example, making indigenous peoples participate in the lawmaking formal process. In Peru, a few years ago, after a massacre in the Bagua region, the Peruvian Congress called for a consultation with indigenous peoples to change laws and to create the consultation bill and so forth. That's one example to learn from. The other one, in Guatemala, indigenous peoples have created their own political party, like, for example, WINAC, and they do participate in the lawmaking process as a political party. They have their representatives in Congress. However, I think that it is also important to make leaders participate in public policy making. The tribal consultations that the US has been holding under the Obama administration were very helpful. And I think that's one other example that we can all learn about for other regions. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else? Yes, Ms. Canales. Yes.
Bien, yo creo que es importante para una participación activa y efectiva de los pueblos indígenas cambiar las reglas de juego en cada país. ¿Y qué quiere decir la regla de juego? Las constituciones políticas de cada país, ¿no? Donde debe reconocer que somos países plurinacionales y que los indígenas también debemos estar en todo ese proceso político de la vida política, se puede decir, ¿no? De los países. Y por eso nosotros venimos proponiendo, por ejemplo, las elecciones por distritos electorales como pueblos indígenas. Y actualmente por eso nuestra propuesta es la Asamblea Constituyente. La Asamblea Constituyente que sea pues popular, soberana, plurinacional y paritaria, y no solamente sea elaborado por un grupo de poder, ¿no? Y asimismo, hemos visto que hay instrumentos internacionales de derecho de pueblos indígenas como el Convenio 169, pero cada país le saca la vuelta, como le ha sacado la vuelta a la consulta previa y que verdaderamente no te garantiza un derecho efectivo.
Well, I believe that to have active participation, we need to change the rules of the game. That is, to change the constitution in many cases. Because we need to be recognized as countries that are plurinational. We need to propose, and we are proposing as a group to have elections per districts. And of course, that involves a constitutional assembly. We need an equal, fair constitutional assembly. Of course, there are international instruments, but they do not seem to generate any changes.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Mr. Slack, did you want to comment or you okay?
Yes, thank you, Representative Holland. I'd make 2 points in response to your question. I think one thing that's particularly important is helping strengthen capacity of indigenous peoples in the region to use laws and legal mechanisms to defend their rights, including their rights to political participation. So Earth Rights, every year we host an indigenous legal training seminar in which we help strengthen and contribute to the ability of indigenous lawyers and leaders to actually use laws to defend rights. So that we think is an important approach to increasing indigenous political participation and engagement in political dialogue. A second important component, I think, is strengthening indigenous organizations' ability to change narratives about indigenous peoples and their role in the countries in which they live, so that they are not perceived as being anti-development or against the interests of the country, but they have their own rights and their own ability to promote their self-determination, which can also help advance the overall development of the country in which they find themselves. And by strengthening indigenous rights, helps contribute to the progress of the country as a whole. So So changing the narrative that Indigenous people are somehow anti-development or opposed to the overall interests of the nation, I think is important.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for all of your responses. And Mr. Grijalva, I would like to yield to you if you have questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's very, very quick questions, and the comments have been made, and from my colleagues and the panelists, I want to thank them very much. Mr. Keene said some things at the end of a discussion in terms of recommendations that I think are very, very good. And I appreciate that. And also appreciate, I think, one of the recommendations, with all embarrassment due to Chair Holland, that a cabinet position, particularly Interior, for an Indigenous person, my preference being Deb Haaland, in the Biden-Harris, would go a long way to having somebody at a cabinet level that on the issue that we're talking about today would come with a depth of knowledge and a mindset that we all support and believe is very important. So anyway, on that. Mr. Slack, I was just going to ask you a question. Let me give you, it's a real example, and maybe you can respond in terms of another strategic mechanism for dealing with creating the rights of Indigenous people in the Americas. Mining company Rio Tinto creates this sacrilege in Australia to the Aborigine people. Then the other parts of Latin America. And then here in the United States, this is where the connection happens. They have been given land essentially by the federal government to conduct mining in Arizona that is affecting Indigenous people, the Apache tribe specifically, in such a way that ancestral, sacred, cultural connections to them would be destroyed. And I bring that up as a foreign multinational company doing business with the United States. Shouldn't there be, at the very minimum, an evaluation as to whether that business should be conducted or not, in terms of, in this case, transferring public land to them?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there should be an expectation that corporations, especially multinational corporations, will respect local laws and the basic rights of impacted communities and be held accountable for that. I mean, that would just be a basic sort of principle that needs to be respected. On the flip side of that, there also needs to be a way to hold corporations like Rio Tinto and others that cause damage in countries in Latin America, for example, accountable, which is not always easy to do in the countries themselves. So being able to use U.S. legal mechanisms to do that effectively, we think is important. And our ability to do that has been increasingly undermined by recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions, which have chipped away at laws that have allowed that in the past. So strengthening the overall legal framework for corporate accountability, especially for companies in these sectors, is critically important. In the example you raised, and so many others around.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair, and thank you very much. This is excellent hearing. I appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much. It's a delight to be here with so many important members of Congress. Let me start with, and I don't know if we asked this question, so forgive me, but you can expand on it if you would. And that is the implementation of the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that the Organization of American States has taken to implement the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to what extent, if at all, has that declaration influenced government policy. So let me simplify that to say, has there been any attempt by governments and anyone can answer this question, to even address the question of Indigenous people. Does anyone have any occasion or any example of that, and how do we address that? Do we view that positively? Should that be sort of a framework? And I think I saw Mr. Kripo. Please, I yield to you, sir. All right, is that Leonardo? Can you hear me? He's unmuting. Mr. Leonardo? Yes. Then let me go with Mr. Keene, if I could, Mr. Yeah, is that Mr. Keene?
Yes, it is.
Please go ahead and we'll work with Leonardo. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay, so sure. With regard to advances in Indigenous peoples' rights, particularly in the Americas, the past decades we've seen significant advances on paper. Most of the countries in the Americas now, either in their constitutions or through national laws, recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples. We've also seen the advances at the international arena. We've got a permanent forum on Indigenous issues, which is a very high-level UN body. We have an expert mechanism. We have a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. But this recognition is only as good as its implementation, and I think that's where things are not moving so quickly. But as I think Representative McGovern said in his opening statement, the legal framework is there, the jurisprudence is there. There have been court cases, one in national courts and regional courts, like the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, that uphold Indigenous peoples' rights to collective ownership of their lands and resources, their right to free, prior, and informed consent. And so there are gains there, but we need to turn those gains into action.
Thank you very much. And so the infrastructure is there, but it doesn't translate to the people. Land is still being taken. People are still being, I hesitate to use the word, but treated brutally, if you will, not with disrespect.
Exactly.
Leonardo, are you ready? Were you trying to speak to answer the question?
Yes.
Go right
Yes,
ahead.
I'm ready now.
All right, thank you.
The question that you made is very important. In the Organization of American States has actually adopted a plan of action endorsed by all members of the organization, including the United States, to implement the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is a 5-year plan. It is coming to an end, I believe, next year. As a result, every member of the organization has to provide a report of the actions taken by the government to implement the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Organization of American States holds an annual meeting in Washington, D.C., in its headquarters here in Washington, D.C., to hear those reports, as well as to hear from Indigenous peoples themselves. It happens usually during a week in every August, and it is called the Indigenous Peoples Inter-American Week. Unfortunately, because of the lack of resources that this organization is struggling with, there hasn't been a robust discussion about key issues related to the declaration. But I believe that the United States can play a big role in strengthening that forum. I have to say that since 2006, the United States government has started to stop engaging in the development of this American Declaration that was adopted 10 years later, and this happened during the Bush administration. That policy, that situation didn't change, and since then the US government didn't participate fully in all the debates about this declaration, as it has done since 1994. However, the United States is engaging in the annual gathering of Indigenous peoples and members of the Organization of American States to discuss implementation, but I believe that it can do much more than what it's doing currently. These discussions are happening, and I believe that the US can make the discussion be more robust and more focused on critical issues such as land rights, natural resource rights, political participations that were the issues discussed during today's hearing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to refer to this issue.
Thank you. I have one more question. I see Mr. Johnson there. Mr. Johnson, I have one more question. Thank you. I just want a clarification, Mr. Cripple. Are you saying that the United States is engaged in the discussions but not helping for the implementation? I note that we did not sign it in 2016, the declaration. So are you saying we're engaged but we're not helping to implement it?
The United States since 2006, when the declaration was being discussed with indigenous peoples, stopped engaging fully in the debate. When the declaration was adopted in 2016, the United States decided to support the adoption of a plan of action to implement the declaration. And it participates every year in the annual discussion, but the participation of the United States government has been limited because of that decision made back in 2006 not to engage fully in the discussions relating to the rights of indigenous peoples under this particular instrument. That policy change can be made today, and I think it is time that the United States engage as it did in the past, because it did lead to changes in behavior of many countries in the region.
Okay, this is my last question. It's to anyone, but I'd like Ms. Poma to be able to answer it. And that is, what is the devastation of losing land, and what impact are we having on children when human rights are violated? So whoever can, but if Ms. Poma could answer first on the loss of land and the impact of the denial of human rights to children. Thank you.
Bien, yo creo que es muy importante, bueno, las mujeres indígenas y los pueblos indígenas siempre pensamos en un territorio colectivo, no individual, sino colectivo, porque históricamente somos pueblos colectivos, pero que nos han ido despojando de nuestros territorios. Entonces, este despojo del territorio trae grandes impactos. El impacto, por ejemplo, a la salud, porque sabemos que en nuestros territorios están las plantas medicinales. En nuestro territorio está nuestra seguridad y soberanía alimentaria. Pero con la destrucción del territorio, pues destruyen todo esto y por lo tanto destruyen nuestras vidas. Con las actividades extractivas hay mucha gente, por ejemplo en el Perú, muchos hermanos y hermanas nuestros, niños que tienen metales pesados en la sangre. Los ríos están totalmente contaminados, ya no hay peces y los peces también tienen metales pesados. La tierra por esa contaminación ya no produce lo mismo. Y para nosotras es una preocupación, sobre todo las mujeres, que todo esto trae la recarga de trabajo. A las mujeres se nos recarga en el trabajo, porque somos las que cuidamos, ¿no?, de nuestros enfermos, la que estamos permanentemente en el territorio, porque los hombres salen en busca de trabajo y somos las mujeres y los niños que nos quedamos en el territorio y nos afecta esto grandemente y muchas veces se promueve también la violencia que sufrimos juntamente con nuestros hijos y por ende la desnutrición y la anemia en niños y niñas indígenas es pues abismal en nuestros países.
Well, it is important to take into account that we think of a collective territory because historically we are a collective. Now, this has a great and extractive industries have a great impact in our lives, in our health, because, for example, we have ancient knowledge and medicinal plants. also this affects our food security and sovereignty. Now, this destruction caused by extractive industries affects all of this that I have mentioned in our lives, people and children with that have heavy metals in their bloods. And also they pollute our rivers, our source of fresh water. Also, it is important to take into account that this generates a work overload for women because we are the ones that take care of the family and the ones that stay in the territory. It is important to also take into account that children suffer from malnutrition and related issues.
Thank you so very much. Did anyone else want to answer that question about children? Yes. Please go ahead, Ms. Swartz.
Thank you. Yes, we've also looked at the harm to the rights of children associated with development projects. As Melania was speaking about, the specific health impacts associated with mining projects are particularly devastating to children, to their smaller and developing bodies. In addition to those specific health impacts, we also see children really suffering from ongoing violence, the destruction of the social fabric of these communities, the criminalization of their parents and the other adult leaders in their community has a deep and lasting impact on the rights of children. And we've done a lot of advocacy over the years to make sure that the development banks and the U.S. government is pushing these development banks to really assess the potential impacts and risks of these development projects and the violence and the other impacts that they're going to bring and how that specifically impacts children. And there is some movement there, but it is still an area that needs a lot more attention. There's other issues that are starting to kind of come into, that they're starting to shed a spotlight on, including the sexual exploitation and abuse of children associated with some of these big infrastructure projects. That needs a lot more attention as well. So definitely appreciate you asking the question, because it's definitely something that needs, a lot more attention and championing by the U.S. government to make sure that these development projects are looking at these and mitigating those risks for children.
Very kind. I will end by saying Indigenous people's rights are human rights, and human rights are Indigenous people's rights. Thank you for this hearing. I see Mr. Johnson, but I've been asked by the staff to yield back to Deb Haaland. Thank you so very much. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. And yes, yielding to our esteemed colleague, Mr. Hank Johnson.
Thank you, Representative Haaland. Mr. Crippa, Indigenous people frequently encounter plural legal systems, state and non-state. So non-state legal systems are more traditional, established, culturally based resolution bodies or dispute resolution bodies. In post-conflict areas, it's critical to pursue justice not just in state legal or official systems, but also in these non-state bodies to promote long-term peace and reconciliation. What is the role of community non-state legal systems or culturally based non-state legal systems in securing justice and equality and also bringing prosperity for indigenous populations?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. To respond to your question, I would like to refer to one example, the situation in Guatemala. Indigenous peoples' justice systems are starting to be recognized by the courts of states, in particular in Guatemala. Unfortunately, it has been a long history of denial of that power of communities to dispute resolutions or address issues developing or taking place within their lands. In Guatemala, after the internal armed conflict, a peace accord was created addressing indigenous people's rights, and that calls for the government to take actions in legislation and policy to uphold indigenous people's court systems. Unfortunately, that is taking too long to happen. However, there are examples in the country of some indigenous nations that are starting to decide cases, and those decisions are starting to be taken into account both by the government and the judiciary. For example, the 48 Cantones of Totonicapans, it's one of the oldest indigenous organizations in Guatemala that pre-existed colonial times and continues to exist today. That particular nation is deciding cases. It has a very strong management system of natural resources, and those decisions are starting to be taken into account by the government. However, that is just one exception. It is not the rule throughout the countries, and I believe that is the same situation in all other countries in Mexico, Central and South America. The American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples call governments to uphold the rights of indigenous nations, communities, and tribes to decide cases and respect the decisions by their tribal courts. Thank you.
If anyone has anything they want to add to that, please feel free at this time, any of the panelists. Well, hearing none, Mr. Cripper, what can we do in the United States to help ensure that culturally based dispute resolution processes are given adequate position in the protection of the rights of indigenous populations? What can we in the U.S. do to promote the existence and the vitality of culturally based dispute resolution processes within our ability to promote equality for indigenous people around in Latin America?
Thank you again for this very important question. I would like to respond quickly right now, and then I would like to provide you in writing a more comprehensive response to this very important question. I think there are many things that the US government can do. One of the things that, as an Argentinian attorney practicing law in the region and then moving to the United States to work for the Indian Law Resource Center in Washington, D.C., I was amazed to learn about the United States tribal justice system and the fact that Indian nations in the US are semi-sovereign entities and can and have the power to adjudicate over issues affecting members and their economic integrity and so forth. That particular justice system and that respect to that particular tribal justice system doesn't exist in most of the countries in Mexico, Central and South America. So I believe that sharing the lessons learned from these decades of relationship between government and government in the US, between the federal government and the tribal government, is something that countries in Mexico, Central and South America can learn a lot, simply because they deny their own indigenous peoples to have that chance to afford justice to their members and to take into account the issues that are affecting their members when they happen within their territories. Exchanges of or workshops with lawmakers that are also concerned about these issues in the Congress of these other countries is something that can happen as well. And I believe that the US Congress can play a very important role in that regard. There are, as I mentioned before, in the Organization of American States annual meetings to discuss indigenous issues. Tribal justice system can be one of those issues, and I believe that it provides a platform for the US government to provide examples, to seek responses, to seek changes, and much needed discussion on these very important issues. Thank you again.
Thank you. Ms. Palmer, Indigenous women have a long legacy at the forefront of social and racial and gender justice fights in Latin America. However, they are consistently denied access to justice and face the highest barriers to gaining political power. What can we as members of Congress do to uplift leaders like yourself and foster direct pipelines to a seat at the table of governance?
Bien, desde los pueblos indígenas siempre pensamos en una justicia regenerativa, se puede decir, regenerativa, que haya sanación, cambios de actitud de las personas que están sancionadas o sentenciadas, y que no solamente sea una sanción o algo punitivo, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que es importante tomar en cuenta ello y fortalecer la justicia indígena, la justicia ancestral, y no imponer desde la justicia ordinaria, ¿no? Que tenemos que hacer las sanciones. Y eso tiene que ver con la autonomía y la libre determinación también de los pueblos. Sabemos que las mujeres indígenas y hacia afuera, pero en estos momentos, por ejemplo, nosotras como organizaciones indígenas venimos promoviendo modificación de estatutos comunales, donde se va incorporando la justicia en el tema de violencias, las distintas o las múltiples violencias que se dan hacia nosotras las mujeres indígenas. Y eso tiene que ver con cambios normativos en las propias comunidades, pero también el respeto y el fortalecimiento de las autonomías y la justicia indígena, ¿no? En los países. Y creo que eso sería importante que se pueda promover, ¿no?
Well, as Indigenous peoples, we believe in a justice that could regenerate, that could heal, that do not only impose sanctions. So I believe it is important to strengthen Indigenous justice and not only imposing the sanctions from other levels. This is part of the free determination of the people. We need to take into account that in Indigenous communities, we have internal struggles as well as external. And so we need to promote communal strategies and changes in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Keene.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. I'd just like to add to this and tie it to U.S. foreign assistance. The United States Agency for International Development funds justice system projects, conflict resolution projects throughout the Americas. And very rarely do those funds and those programs support the local indigenous systems of justice. And I think that's one place where we can really advance the recognition and legalization of indigenous systems of justice. And Guatemala, for example, large parts of Guatemala don't have access to the government justice system. And when they do have access, it's often very biased against them. And so you see in Guatemala, large parts of the country and other countries where the only system of justice that works is the indigenous system of justice. And we should be supporting those places where that is working. And, there's plenty of examples. So I just add that. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. And unless there is anyone else, I don't see anyone else. I want to thank you all so much again for taking the time to be with us today, for your heartfelt testimony, for helping to ensure that we are moving on the right track. And just know that this is a subject that me and my colleagues care deeply about. So we look forward to being in touch, and please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. And anyone who is giving any follow-up answers, we look forward to getting those. And if anyone has anything else to submit in writing, we would welcome that. So thank you again, and this will conclude our hearing today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.